Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us at this Issues and Ideas event here in Lansing, Michigan. So I'm Jarrett Skorup. I'm the Vice President of Marketing Communications at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. We're really happy to sponsor this one today. So if you don't know, the Mackinac Center, we are a free market economic think tank. We're headquartered in Midland, Michigan, and then we have this office in Lansing. We've been around for more than 35 years now, and we inform in the public policy space. So we come at things from the free market perspective. We cover areas of fiscal policy, energy, environmental, criminal justice, education, and we interact a lot with Lansing lawmakers, local officials, state officials, and we try to kind of get our perspective out there on a lot of issues. Today's a really perfect event for us. It was kind of tough when we were trying to come up with some ideas for another event to do, because we knew that putting something in September of this year was going to be right in the height of election season. Have you guys heard there's an election going on? And so, yeah, you know, you can look all that stuff up later, have that talk over lunch. So we said, well, what's an interesting kind of topic we wanted to do? And so we thought, let's talk about a little bit of the core of what the Mackinac Center does and some other good people that think about this area, which is really, how do we use, what is public policy? How do we actually interpret all of the data and the statistics out there? You're out there getting all these ads that are throwing statistics at you that you have no way of knowing how true or not. And how can you look at that? What kind of lens can you use to actually inform having opinions on things, and kind of talk through the practical of how some of the groups here in the state of Michigan actually do that. So, you know, it's really great timing, because last night we had a presidential debate. Obviously, those were people that just, you know, they were using sound data. They were talking about the real trade-offs, and they were offering clear solutions in a respectful manner. So hopefully this talk will be a little bit more of that. So today's topic, it's lies, damn lies, and statistics. How to use data to inform public policy. So looking at where we are flooded with all this data and information out there. So what can a regular person do? What can the media do? What can lawmakers do? We have a little bit of everyone in those areas here today. And then how do public policy experts try to actually inform the opinion of different groups that are out there? So we are happy to be joined today. We've got Dr. Jeremy Weber. He's a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and he's the author of Statistics for Public Policy. And I found when academics write books, they usually come up with the title, and then the publisher pushes them on the subtitle. So a practical guide for being mostly right, or at least respectably wrong. That's what I do when I have these family gatherings and arguments. I just tell them, you are respectably wrong. And then we have Craig Teal. Craig is with the Citizens Research Council. I think the oldest public policy group in Michigan got to be from 1916. I took 2 years from them. And then we have Michael Van Beek. Mike's the Director of Research at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. So the way it'll work, each of them will have a short presentation. I'll do some moderated questions. As you go and listen, write down your questions. We'll gather those and then ask some questions from the audience at the end. So first up, we have Jeremy Weber.
All right, fantastic. Well, I'm excited to be here. It's a great topic and a great context for this and moment. Let's see. So do I go up there? Yeah. Okay, great. All right, perfect. So I'm going to provide just a few high-level observations and comments about the use of statistics in policy, and then we can dive into more detail in the Q&A. I feel like we have unfair expectations for statistics often. We know language is often used to mislead, to obfuscate. And then many of us can be surprised when statistics are used in a similar way. And the language, but why would we expect anything different from statistics than from language. And my argument would say, hey, they have both of the same issues. They both can be used to mislead and obfuscate. And there really is no alternative to educating ourselves and growing in our ability to not be misled or to use in a clarifying, helpful way. That's how we're going to be able to spot the statistical wolf in sheep's clothing. And I want to make this somewhat provocative claim that we can't avoid making statistical-like claims. We might make them without statistics, but we will still make them. And just to be clear and concrete on what statistics are, if I talk to Dave here and I get his experience about something, that's one observation, that's one piece of data. If I talk to many of you and I want to summarize across experiences, I use a statistic to get that summary. So a statistic is simply a summary of many observations. Well, think about conversations about policy, why we should be changing policy on X. We've got a couple statements here. You might have heard things like this. We have a blank crisis. Many people are losing their homes because of this bill will. These are all statements about severity, pervasiveness, causal relationships. These are statistical claims. They might not have any statistics associated with them, meaning there's no actual systematic observation behind these. It's just a conversation with Dave. And suddenly, what Dave's experiencing now is leading to the conclusion there's a housing crisis or what have you. So we're going to make these statistical-like claims regardless. We form beliefs about whether something's common, whether it's an isolated occurrence, and sometimes we actually have statistics to back them up. And I would say our statistical-like claims are better tethered to, anchored to statistics. Otherwise, the conversation can go all over the place, people making bold statistic-like claims that are untethered from actual observation. You know, how common is it that that work requirement led to such and such an effect, for example? And now I want to just give you three common ways or three examples of how statistics can be used in confusing and unhelpful ways. One stems from confusion over the role of statistics in a policy discussion. You've probably heard of statements like, we need data-driven decisions, we need science-based policy. And a subtext of that can be, come on, let's be mature adults and let's just let the data speak and it will tell us what to do. But I would argue statistics can't tell us what to do any more than a map tells you in what destination do you want to be. Think about that. We don't go to maps asking the map to say, where should I be? We go to the map to give us a sense of the landscape, to tell us what is the relationship between things, the distance. If I want to go to such and such destination, what roads could I take? How long would it take to get there? What are some of the trade-offs involved in going to the beach versus to the mountains? That's what maps do. They aid in a conversation among the people in the car over, well, should we go here versus there? They're not a conversation stopper. They don't select the destination for us. And yet oftentimes statistics are used as if they do select the destination and there's really no need for a conversation. And then if you're not going on board with whatever destination the statistics supposedly support, you're sticking your head in the sand, you're being stubborn, you're being ignorant. And here's an example. So here's a statement or a conclusion of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They say, if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need net zero emissions by 2050 globally. All right, that's a nice map-like statement. They're just saying, hey, if you want to go to this other place, you got to take a different road. All right, fair point. But you don't know how many times I've heard this quoted, and then it treated as if, well, then obviously we need a $7,500 tax credit on EVs, and any sort of green sounding policy must be supported. Well, no. This is a map-like statement, and now we can talk about where do we want to go and what sort of costs we want to incur to get there. All right, second source of confusion is many people are familiar with correlation isn't causation. And you maybe have taken a stats course and they talked about how, well, when it rains, umbrellas are also out, and maybe the umbrellas cause rain. Well, we know that's not right, but that's the example that's used. Well, I don't think policymakers and in policy discussions, we make that mistake often. We know intuitively, yeah, the umbrellas are not causing the rain. The more subtle and common source of confusion is where we see a correlation and it does reflect a true causal relationship, but it misrepresents how important that causal relationship is. And it makes a minor cause of an issue look like a major cause. And here's an example. This is done all the time in policy. I'm going to call out a statement by President Trump, just because I worked in the Council of Economic Advisors and I had to review speeches like this for their factual content, and so this would annoy me a bit. But so this is President Trump speaking. I approve the Keystone XL pipeline and the Dakota Access pipelines immediately upon assuming office, and then he cites some other administrative actions supportive of the oil and gas industry. And then he says, under the Trump administration, the U.S. has increased oil production by 3.1 million barrels per day. So there you've got the correlation, administrative actions, rise in oil production. There's the correlation. And I'd argue there's a causal connection. Like, it did not hurt to have these pipelines. It did not hurt to approve ANWR for drilling and so on. Like, there's clearly a causal connection to some degree between those actions and oil production at some point. But the driver of this 3.1 million barrel increase was a pretty large increase in prices. Last 2 years of the Obama administration were very low prices, and then the Trump administration enjoyed a few years of higher prices, and producers were responding to that. They were responding to a 45% or so increase in oil prices. That was the major cause. These other administrative actions were very minor causes. All right, lastly, a source of confusion can be with models. Models are simply a combination of statistics and theory to simulate some part of the world, the economy, a disease outbreak, as was the case in COVID. But what can happen in reporting the predictions of these models is they become untethered from their scenarios. The models are always about what happens under a certain state of the world. If X, Y, or Z happen, then what are we predicting? And so the predictions get out in the media, they get out in the conversation, and they become untethered with, well, what were you assuming? What was part of the scenario you modeled? I'm using an image here of Ambassador Birx, who was an important player in the White House Coronavirus Task Force. And in a briefing, she and others of the White House used this figure showing the results of a model that said in no intervention scenario that we're going to have potentially 2.2 million COVID-related deaths by the summer of 2020. Now, if you read that, you say no intervention, you're thinking, well, what does that mean? Well, the way it was interpreted in the media and reported in the newspapers was, absent government intervention, we're going to have 2.2 million deaths, potentially or likely. But if you dig into what scenario is actually modeled, it's not just the government doesn't get involved. It's assuming that no one actually changes their behavior in response to the increased risk. So it's assuming that people are hearing about death, they're watching hospitals fill up, and they're carrying on their business as usual. And we knew early in March that was wildly untrue, because we saw in the mobility data that people were changing their behavior independent of government action. And the biggest driver of change in behavior was not government action. It was personal decisions about risk. And that was the driver. So that's a wildly inaccurate or inappropriate assumption that's behind this curve. And it would have been a fine prediction. Just be clear, that's what that prediction assumes. And I'll stop there and say that my attempt at helping people add more clarity and less confusion to statistical use in public policy is represented in this book, which is really oriented especially to somebody who's trying to help a decision maker better understand an issue, better make a decision. That's the focus of that book. Anyway, I'll stop there, and I'm excited to hear what questions you all have and what these gentlemen have to say as well.
All right. Yeah, thank you to Mackinac Center for inviting me to participate. I really appreciate it. I've been a attendee before. I've never been a speaker. So, be careful. You may end up here just like I did at some point. I'd like to spend a little time. I think Professor Weber really laid out some great kind of cautions about using statistics. I want to share with you how my organization uses statistics and bring into the conversation a very salient and kind of unfortunately ongoing perennial issue, which is how are we going to improve Michigan's roads? The narrative out there is that Michigan has long underfunded its roads and that it's going to take billions of dollars to improve that. And so our research around this topic has centered on what's the data to support that? Where is the data? We've heard statistics about Michigan funding its roads at the lowest level per capita of anyone in the Great Lakes states, and that Michigan's roads are the worst in the country. So we said, well, let's go find the data that's being used to advocate for higher taxes on road users in the state. And we wanted to know what the correlation was between increased funding and road quality. So we began with, let's figure out how to measure Michigan's roads and quality of roads. There are thousands of statistics across different levels of roads on the condition of roads. There's no one single statistic. So we developed an index, 17 different measures, looking across all the states. This is federal data that all states report. They've been doing this for decades. And sure enough, our index showed that out of the 50 states, Michigan's 40th or 50th. So we could confirm that we have bad roads in Michigan, at least relative to the nation and other states. We also did an analysis to figure out, well, who are our peer states? Because comparing Michigan to California or Michigan to Rhode Island just doesn't make sense. So we had a peer state analysis, and of our 11 peer state group, we're 10th. So sure enough, we can confirm poor roads. Something should be done about it. So then we wanted to look, and I'm talking to the congregation here who would agree, who just drove here, that we have poor roads in Michigan. So on the funding issue, again, how does the funding in Michigan compare relative to other states? Again, trying to draw a correlation between road quality and funding. And again, we developed a novel index using federal highway data and census data, because there's no one measure of funding for highways. And maybe based on the amount of funding per capita makes sense, but I could also make the argument the amount of funding per lane mile, per truck VMT makes sense. So we incorporated those measures into our index, and the result was Michigan isn't the lowest funded state in the country. We can confirm that. It's not the highest. It's a little below average, about 30 out of 50, and in peer states, 7 out of 11. So right now we're saying, okay, we've got really bad quality roads, fairly high funding, relatively high funding. So is more money the question? So let's look here. We looked at our peer states and we came up with a performance index, basically a performance gap, looking at the road index funding. Basically, the higher number means better funded roads. Compare that to the pavement condition index. Higher number, higher quality roads. In Michigan, there's a gap, a 10 position gap. Other states have higher gaps. In Pennsylvania, for example, has very high road funding and fairly low road quality.
I can confirm that.
But some of our peer states that aren't too far from us, Ohio and Indiana, have relatively, in the case of Indiana, lower funding models than us, but much higher quality roads. So we don't have to look too far to say, you know, what's going on in those states that they're doing with their road funding. And so we did this for the entire 50 state set. And what we found is there's not really a strong correlation between road funding and road quality, which doesn't really resonate with us intuitively. We would think more money, higher quality roads, but that's not what the data is suggesting. So borrowing a thought from Dr. Weber's book, talking about the policy analysts having to wear two hats, both the statistician, the data I've presented you, and kind of the detective. What are we really seeing? What might be explanations? So the statistician sees very little correlation between pavement condition and funding. However, if we went back, and I know I had to blaze through that scatter plot real quick, but 25 states, half of the states were clustered up in this top left corner, which was not super high road funding, but very high road quality. So there are half of the states are doing good quality road repairs with relatively little funding. Similarly, there's a number of states that aren't doing so great on the road quality with higher levels of funding. And Michigan happens to be in that group. So, and we came up with some explanations for the outlier states. And that's what the statistics tell us. So we said, well, what, as a detective, when we kind of look for other explanatory factors, what might not be captured in those indices that we created, and we looked at those. And climate, and we could discount climate because we didn't see any connection. Distribution of road funding. Well, this is one we're really keyed in on because Michigan has a very decentralized road funding system. So right there, you might find some inefficiencies. Heavy truck traffic. Michigan has higher truck weights allowed on the road, which create higher and more damage. So that might be an area of further inquiry. And then asset management. How are states and local road agencies employing the dollars that they get? Are there better ways to do that? So as a policy response, we're suggesting before running to the intervention of higher taxes and more funding, let's look at what other states are doing with the funding they have and figure out, can we do better with the resources we have? Certainly, money is going to play an issue, but before we exhaust looking at these other possible explanatory reasons for Michigan's condition, we should think about that before we move on to just immediately higher funding. So that's my comments. I'll turn it over to Mike now.
Okay, thanks, Craig. I'm Mike Van Beek, Director of Research at the Mackinac Center, and I just want to share two stories about a work that I've done with my colleagues that illustrate some of the important points that Professor Weber makes in his book. One of them is that it's very important to know your data. And I think that we assume too much. Professor Weber kind of implies this in his book, maybe because he's more polite than me. But we assume that researchers and experts know a lot more about their data than what they actually do. And a lot of times they skip over sort of fundamental questions that they should be asking themselves about their data. Is this appropriate? How is this data created? Is it right to answer the kinds of questions I'm asking? So I want to just share two stories. One of them is when the Mackinac Center got involved in a Supreme Court case in 2017. So this was what became the Janus decision, which was about public sector unions and whether public employees would be forced to financially support a union in their workplace. And the Supreme Court was worried, or at least asking the question of, if they no longer force public employees to support government unions, will government unions even exist? Do they require forced support to function? Which actually says something about them if that is what they require. But this was what the Supreme Court was interested in. We had lots of information about this. We knew the data on this information really well. And so we submitted, my colleagues, litigation team submitted a amicus brief to the Supreme Court. And what we had to tell them was that there's some big problems with the data that they were looking at to try to answer this question. And the data was from the US Census Bureau. So this is official government data. But as we dug into it, we realized that it was very limited in its power to tell us what was happening with public sector unions and public employees. And it might actually be compromised and unhelpful, actually. So what we discovered was that a big problem was with the wording in one of the questions in the survey that is used to create this data. So the question that is asked of a survey respondent was, are you a member of a labor union or of an employee association similar to a union? Raise your hand if you know what an employee association similar to a union is. But one person. Okay, good. I don't either. And actually, the people answering this question didn't know either, or were at least confused. And we could show that because in states that don't allow government unions, about 10% of the people in those states still answered that question yes, that they are part of a non-existent illegal government union. So they were clearly confused by this question. The sample size that was used for this survey was also questionable. So this is the current population survey that the US Census Bureau does, and it surveys 60,000 people around the country. That's a good number. But when you drill down to the information that the Supreme Court was interested in, it's just for public employees and who are working in a job where they might be unionized. So only 15,000 of the 60,000 people are asked this question about whether they're in a union. So that's reduced the size of the sample right there. And then we're only looking at the answers from public employees, which is only a slice of that 15,000. And then we have to look at it at state level, at the state data. So because that's where the policy changes are. So that further reduces the sample to the point where the data that we get from some states might be based on just a couple hundred responses, or maybe even just a few dozen responses from surveys. So it wasn't as powerful of survey data as the US Supreme Court assumed it was. And actually, Jarrett played a big part in this because of finding this out about this data, about how limited it is and how we can't really use it to answer questions we're interested in. We decided to just go get our own data. And so we collected data directly from government employers, and we got a much better idea of what is actually happening on the ground with public sector unions and their employees, and what would happen if the Supreme Court made this decision to no longer allow forced dues. Now, the answer didn't change, actually. Like, the data both suggested the same thing, which is that government unions can easily exist without forced support. But we have now a much better picture and idea of how this actually plays out on the ground. The second story is, many of you may have heard this or something similar to this. How many of you have heard that about 40% of Michiganders right now are struggling to make ends meet? And that time, right? We've heard this. There's been lots of, you've maybe seen it in the media, maybe seen a politician refer to it, suggesting, of course, this suggests that poverty is a much bigger problem maybe than what we typically believe. And there's a report that is published on a regular basis. It's called the ALICE report. And ALICE stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. Okay, I'll come back to that acronym in a second. But the idea behind this study is good and fine. It's trying to figure out, are there people out there, how many people out there are not eligible for the poverty programs, the federal government programs and state programs that we have to help people who are in poverty, but who are still struggling financially, right? So they don't qualify for these programs because they earn too much money, but they still need a lot of help financially. You can see how this might be attractive to certain politicians who might use this as a way to say, well, we need a different government program or more programs or bigger ones or things like that. But there are major problems with this report in the way they use statistics. And this is twice now I've commented Jarrett here, commended him. He did a lot of work on this as well. But my colleagues dug deep into this report and into the data that they were using. And we tried to reproduce the statistic that they came up with, and we discovered these major problems. One of them is that although the report is called ALICE, and so it's looking at asset limited, income constrained, employed people, it doesn't actually try to quantify how many people are asset limited, income constrained, and employed. Instead, it just assumes that the population it's identified in the data has those characteristics. Okay, and I'm not making this up. That's what it does. It just assumes that they have those characteristics, and some of them probably do, but we don't actually know what the percentage is. It is not 40% because the report actually doesn't prove that. And what's worse about all of this is that the report does not disclose this to readers in any way. So it is misleading. And there are dozens or maybe hundreds of news reports out there that are written assuming that this is the case. They're basically false. But that rarely gets pointed out. What the study does instead is it creates a budget, a hypothetical budget that it calls the household survival budget. And it assumes everyone has to meet those expenses, okay? And then it just counts up how many households earn less than that budget, and then it declares all of those households to be ALICE, okay? Even though some of them are going to be unemployed, some of them are not going to have income constraints, some of them are not going to have their assets limited. That's simply what it does. And the other part of this that is misleading is that household budget is built on data about average levels of household spending. So think about that for a second. It's the survival budget, and they're using average levels of spending. That's obviously the wrong statistic to use, right? What they should be using is the minimum amount that households report spending on these common household items, right? That would give you an idea of what a survival budget is like, right? Instead, using the average, really what the report is saying is about 40% of households in Michigan earn income that is below the average amount that most households spend, which is like a total nothing burger, right? Like, who cares? It doesn't really mean much. In fact, it's probably just a statistical reality that if you're looking at the average amount of spending, about 40% of the people are going to spend less than that, right? That's just a reality. So that's really all this report shows us. But it has been interpreted in a sort of misleading way to give an image of something that doesn't really exist. Now, why does this matter? Why should you care? Well, you should care. I guess you could say, look, they're highlighting the issue of poverty. Isn't that a good thing? Who cares if they exaggerate it a little bit? I think you should care because Thomas Sowell says, there's no solutions in public policy. There's only trade-offs. And the time and energy we spend at these imaginary problems is time and energy we can't spend on the real ones. And so there are people who are in need of help and can't make ends meet, and we need to figure out how to help them. But if we spend time addressing these imaginary, systemic, huge problems, we're going to have less time and energy to help people who really need it. So I think it does matter. And thanks for letting me share your those two stories. And I look forward to the questions.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. So we'll do a couple of questions from me. And as you're sitting there, write yours down. And in about 10, 15 minutes, we'll collect some of those. So my favorite author is Michael Crichton. Well, second favorite, Jeremy Weber, obviously. So in between reading public policy books, I'm a big fan of Michael Crichton. I like a lot of fiction. Wrote Jurassic Park, a bunch of other books. So Michael Crichton has this theory he came up with. It's called the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. So this is how he describes it. You open up the newspaper to an article on some subject that you know really well. You read the article, you see the journalist has absolutely no understanding of either the facts or the issues. The article is often so wrong, it actually presents the story backwards, reversing cause and effect. He calls these wet streets calls rain stories. And he said the newspaper is full of them. In any case, you have expertise in this. You read the story with as exasperation or amusement at the multiple errors in the story. Then you turn the page to national or international affairs, and you read the rest of the newspaper as if it is somehow more accurate than the story that you just read. So he's kind of talking about this concept, and when he first came up with that, I think it was it was decades ago. It was at a time where I think trust in the media was higher, and maybe he was trying to make a point on that, and maybe we've gone too far in the other direction where people don't trust anything that they read. But how should a regular person, if they're reading where they are reading newspapers or, God forbid, a Facebook post or something from somebody, and it has something that they believe or disbelieve, how should they go about trying to understand if this thing is actually true to inform their own opinion?
You're closest to him,
10 seconds or less.
10 seconds or less. That's a tough one. I think you don't have a lot of luck unless you're willing to invest a lot of time in cases where they're simply stating false things, right? Where it's just flat out, they said it's 80% and it's really 20%, and you just never know unless you are an expert in that domain. There's another type of misleading or deception or error where the article itself doesn't actually root its conclusions in anything. And so if you look at, well, what's been said, what sort of evidence has been conveyed, and you're just asking that question as a critical consumer, you realize, oh, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. I'll give you an example. And while working at the Council of Economic Advisors, I was particularly interested in a certain regulatory issue. It was more of a personal interest. Any regulatory change at the federal government involves or gives opportunity to the public to meet with a representative of the White House, actually, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And so these meetings are going on about regulatory changes, and I sometimes would attend ones that were either in my subject area or that I was interested in. Well, I went to one, and I asked some questions. I wasn't, there was outside groups coming to meet with folks in this office, and I was kind of an observer, taking notes, asking some questions. Well, the next day or day or two later, Bloomberg writes an article about how the White House is taking great interest in a particular regulatory change, and it's unusual for the White House, somebody from the Council of Economic Advisors to be at such a meeting. And so what does this signify? If you read the article, all it says is somebody from the White House showed up to a meeting. Because that's all that happened. My boss is not telling me, oh, we're really concerned about that change, exert some pressure or something. It was an academic interest of mine, and I was showing up to a meeting. And unless you're just asking that question, wait, what is this article based on? You're going to be duped into thinking that there's a there, when there was no there. There was one guy showing up to a meeting.
Well, I'm glad you posed this question, Jared, because that was the genesis of this research effort that we're undertaking right now about road funding. And, advocacy groups, interest groups who are in the road building industry, and local governments who rely on the state fuel taxes to support their road programs have banded together and are making the case for increased road investment in Michigan. But they're doing it absent any data. And the one piece of data that we found was Michigan ranked last in road funding in the Great Lakes states. And so we found this statistic, and it didn't take us long. It didn't require a PhD in statistics to kind of go over this number and realize there is no there. This was a number that was, quite honestly, just kind of related to something entirely different, a state budget matter, but not a kind of all-encompassing road funding issue. So once we started digging into it, we said, well, there's got to be better data out there. And what we found out was there's no single metric for road funding across the states. There's no single metric for road quality across the states. So we went about and created an index to explain this to the media, the advocacy groups who are, playing in the Lansing circles, government officials, policymakers. So I guess my response is sometimes it doesn't take that much to dig into this statistical claims that just don't pass the reasonable tests when you initially see them or read them.
That's what I would add too, of having your radar up and ready for things that just don't seem like they fit in real life, your experience. Now, I know we all live in bubbles, and we, you can't just say, well, 10 people that I know don't think that, so it can't be true. But you do have real life experience, and if the information that you're reading about in the newspaper does not fit with that or seems out of touch, then that's where I would identify digging further. Not long ago, I got asked by a newspaper to respond to a story they were writing about how using electric buses improves student achievement for a while. And I thought, wait a minute, there's no way that the type of bus that is used can have an impact on student achievement. I mean, there's not even like a theory for how that could work, right? And as it happened, there was none. And the research that the reporter was using was just totally bogus. And I was able to tell the reporter that and demonstrate it to him, and they never did the story. So you never read about how electric buses can improve student achievement. So, but that's the kind of thing you need to do is ask yourself those kinds of like fundamental questions. Is there even a path to causation here? Or not. And if it's a question or if it seems sketchy, then that's a place to dig further.
A lot of times for researchers, for a lot of, verified groups or groups that have some type of, reputation, they do want to get things out there that are correct factually. So I found that even if I'm reading a study from, a group that's very much on the left from where I sit politically or something, that the facts are correct, but the interpretation is a little bit different. Can you talk about some examples we've seen times times like that, or how if especially for lawmakers that are here, where we're not disagreeing about the facts or the statistics, but maybe with how we apply those to everyday life. Jeremy, you were kind of getting at that in your talk.
Yeah, I'll have to think about an example. I'll let you guys go. I mean, that is common, and that is half or more than half the battle. The number's right, but a right number wrongly understood is as misleading as a wrong number. All right. But I'll let you guys comment.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of tried to address it in my slide deck, in that, in this instance of the road funding, road quality trade-off, clearly more funding will improve roads. I mean, roads cost money. We know that. But to understand the context around the use of those dollars and how they're being employed. So all states have to, by federal law, have a transportation asset management plan, and they submit this to the federal government. It's part of the requirement to receive federal highway funds, because the federal government wants to make sure that states and local agencies are using the funds according to a more or less fix it first mentality. In other words, addressing road deterioration before it gets to the point where it's 3x the cost that it was the day before. So, the broader context around statistics and facts, yes, that fact might be right, but there's other issues that are at play here, and alerting policymakers, decision makers, to these other facts and their weight in determining, a potential outcome or the outcome we've seen is just as important as, the fact that the fact that made it into the briefing document or the talking points.
I don't have a good example I can think of right off the top of my head, but one of the things that Professor Weber says in the book that I think is a great point, especially because I work at the Mackinac Center, is that you should trust think tanks the most, basically. But there actually is a good reason why you should give preference to certain information from different types of organizations. So think tanks and nonprofit research organizations like CRC and others, our whole reputation relies on us being reliable with data, right? If we start making stuff up, then people are going to stop listening to us, and then people are going to stop funding us, and then I'm not going to have a job, right? So it's a real high incentives for us to get the data right and be respectable when we're talking about these issues. Special interest groups and lobbying organizations, they don't have that same kind of incentive structure, right? Like their incentive is to get some sort of policy passed. And so they will be more likely to use whatever statistics they can find to make their argument stronger, right? So, and we'll disagree, the nonprofits and the think tanks will disagree about what the statistics mean and how to interpret those and things like that. But we're at least sort of rooted to the idea that we've got to be respectable to a certain degree. Otherwise, like I said, no one's going to listen to us anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I was talking with a lawmaker one time about that, and they were talking about somebody that came in and wanted more money for something. And I said, here's a good way to know how serious they are. Ask them, what area of the budget should I cut to shift to your spending? And if they don't have anything, they probably just want more money kind of for everywhere. Think of that point of what Mike said, there's no solutions, only trade-offs. What is the trade-off to this? So one of the areas that the Mackinac Center has kind of developed is this concept called the Overton window. So the Overton window, briefly, is that for things that are going to go into law, there's kind of this window of political possibilities. There is this big window of political possibilities, but lawmakers are usually focused on a narrow set within this window. And one of the things that we've talked about at the Mackinac Center is the role as a think tank is, hopefully, we'll be along for a really long time. We do want to influence current public policy. And CRC, you talked about the road funding. That's a very active, ongoing debate. You're doing policy on that. but that there is a role of think tanks or groups to also talk about things that might not be within the window. It might be something people aren't talking about, or it might be a really great idea, but most of the public's not with you. It's outside this window for good or for bad. Can you talk about a role as a researcher in trying to who are you trying to influence? Who is the audience for your ideas, or some of these concepts of things that you might be writing about to kind of move things on that Overton window?
Yeah, I'll just say that that's a great observation about that Overton window. And there are different audiences and different time frames that I find myself writing for. I know that some of my articles, some of my work is to change my colleagues thinking about an issue. And then they're going to be teaching that to their students, and that might show up in 20 years. There are other things. My capstone class in the spring did a report for the city of Pittsburgh, and they were in the middle of reconsidering how they manage deer, or that they manage it at all. And boom, that summer at a city council meeting, all that report was going right into a vote on a contract with the USDA for management. And I find myself somewhere in between those two spectrums. The 2030 generational, changing how people think about an issue, such that when they're a staffer or a staffer on the Hill, and they don't even know why they think about this problem that way, but it will have been because somebody framed the issue for them in that way. It's really hard to trace that cause and effect, but I know it happens because it happens on me, and I see it happen on others. And if you trace back the influences, some of the influences are from 20 years ago.
And real quick, if you have questions, you can pass it down towards the end. Someone from Mackinac will grab that. We'll go into audience questions after this.
Yeah, big fan of the Mackinac Center's Overton Window podcast. I'll just put in a plug there. But the analogy we use at the Research Council is a football analogy. And if you're familiar with the quarterback-receiver relationship, especially on long passes, you're not throwing it as a quarterback to the receiver where he is in that very moment. You're leading the receiver to where they're going to be, and presumably where they're going to be open to catch the ball.
Craig, I'm a Chicago Bears fan, and
You
if
don't
you watch
throw the
our
balls.
they throw to where the receiver was.
Well, as a diehard Lions fan in this rebirth of the franchise, I like our quarterback. But the point being is, much like the Overton window, that's shifting and looking to the future and what is possible, maybe not in this moment, but in the future. Our research needs to take a look at, well, what's going on now, but what is changing outside, within this policy realm, but outside of the conversation right now that will bear on a policy change 2, 5, 10 years down the line, and make sure we address those issues with data, framing, and arguments. So then when the research is out there, it's not stale as soon as it hits the ground. It's forward looking and, addresses those, whether it's, road funding, education spending, healthcare in Michigan. Those things look very different today, well, maybe not road funding, but than they did a decade ago. So
I've got nothing to add. That was great.
Love that. First question is, statistics set policy. So where do people go to get the correct data in order to help set policy or influence policy?
Well, there's more data available to the public, I think, today probably than ever before. It's simpler than ever to go to a government website and download official government data. Of course, I've shared some stories with you about official government data and how you have to be careful with it, even if it is the best we can do. It does. There isn't an easy answer to this. That's why it's difficult. There isn't one source. Maybe the Mackinac Center is the closest. CRC is number 2. But so there isn't one place to go get the right data. You have to do the hard work. You have to dig into it. You have to understand where it comes from, how the data got generated, what is included, what is excluded, what's not in there that maybe should be. Sorry, you just have to do the hard work, I think is part of it. Or find, someone or an organization that and trust who can do that for you, and you can rely on them as well.
Yeah, I think I agree 100% because I live in the data world, and there is more data. And there's been a push by the public for more data from government, transparency, what's government doing? And government has responded by just a data dump. What I think government, public agencies should do is figure out how to take that data and make it meaningful to the people who are consuming that data. And there's ways to do that which aren't partisan, which aren't loaded. Classic example is I just worked on a research project involving, for decades, all we had was school funding at the district level. We could only, and for a school district that operates 3 schools, district level funding is fine. But we have a number of large school districts in the state that operate tens, dozens of schools. Now we have data at the individual school level, financial data, and the state puts that data out there. But in no meaningful way does it present it to us so we can use that school level data to compare across schools. So more data, but less insight. If anything, it's more confusing, I think, to people who are trying to understand, in this instance, school funding, because the data is just so overwhelming and there's been no attempt to, what is the takeaway? And another example would be governments opening up their checkbook. So yeah, you can see how what every check a government wrote was, but is there any attempt to provide a narrative about that? Whether it's the narrative about last year's budget, funding, spending, or importantly, across trends. What are the trends in the data? And those things can be presented in very, like I said, nonpartisan, unbiased, factual ways that will help inform people and help them use the data better.
Yeah, and on that point, I actually heard from one of our supporters one time who said, what the Mackinac Center is really helpful, and he named a couple of other groups as well, as he said, I'm a business owner, I'm busy, I got a lot of stuff going on, there's a million issues happening at the national and state level. He said, you guys are a lens for me of what I should care about. If you're writing on it, I think it's important, and you kind of help. So I think I would just encourage, find a group that you trust, and that hasn't burned you, where you find something they write is false, and that's probably your easiest way. So last question before we wrap up here. And Jeremy, this is probably a good one for you, considering you're working in college, but what do we do to convince young people, especially high school, university students, to actually go to primary sources or find outlets where they actually get their news, rather than just kind of on social media or from one influencer?
Well, that's a battle I'm fighting. I do have to fight that one. Students will, even my graduate students in policy analysis, I'm trying to equip them to really own an issue, be critically engaging with it, breaking it down, and they'll give me memos where they just cite 1 or 2 kind of advocacy pieces, and just base everything off of that one source that has a clear agenda. So it's hard, but at the calls for hope that I have is that at the same time, it's hard, and students need to be alerted to the need to go to the primary source, is that when students have begun to develop the muscles to dig deeper, to find more reliable sources, to ask hard questions, I think I've seen a real satisfaction and contentment in the students in feeling like, oh no, I actually have my mind around this issue. I'm not just parroting someone else's line. I know what I'm talking about. but they're only going to get that confidence if they're going to those primary sources, really thinking about what is the basis for the conclusions being drawn. And when they do, though, they get excited about that newfound capability. But it's a battle that has to be fought.
All right. Well, I apologize. I know we had some questions. We had like 3 or 4 on road funding, so you'll have to come ask Craig yourself here afterwards. But thank you for attending today. And if you want to watch this, we did stream it. You can send it to your friends. I know, it was that invigorating for y'all. Our next event is October 23rd. That will be here, same place, and that is titled "How Free Are We?" Where Michigan ranks on the freedom scale. So we're comparing a bunch of different areas, both economic freedom and social freedom issues, to see where Michigan actually ranks. On your way in, you probably saw a bunch of publications. Please check those out on your way out. We did some on road funding over there, the Michigan Growth Council, some ideas to help grow the state of Michigan. But besides that, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.